All right, Georgia and Clemson kick things off this Saturday at noon, week one of the 2024 college football season, in one of what I think is really four sort of marquee games coming up this Saturday. Georgia, Clemson at noon. Also, West Virginia hosting Penn State. At 3:30, you've got Miami versus Florida, and then the primetime game, Notre Dame on the road at Texas A&M. Now, there's a ton of great games outside of that in week one, and no matter who your team is playing, you're excited to watch them play, with it being week one. And for most people, first opportunity to see your team play. Had a handful of teams play last week in week zero. But in today's video, we're going to talk about Georgia versus Clemson. I'm going to try to break the game down on both sides, give you a winner, maybe a pick against the spread for you gambling degenerates out there. But good morning, it's Uncle Lou here. That's right, it is me, Uncle Lou, live on LouTube for you. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it also. And two, in addition to that as well, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We're just getting ready to kick the season off. Here, I'm getting close to 70,000 subscribers. Help me get there. Hit the thumbs up, share this video out, leave a comment down below. Let me know your pick for this game, Georgia versus Clemson. Georgia, a 13.5-point favorite. Georgia and Clemson have really been going opposite directions since the last time they played. These two teams kicked off the 2021 season, a neutral site game in Charlotte. This game is being played in Atlanta, sort of the return favor from that game, or the sort of the round two of that neutral site series. And look, Clemson was the second best program in America from 2015 to 2020. They won 2 national titles. They beat Bama a handful of times. They were unbelievable. Won the ACC every single year for a bunch of years in a row. And then 2021 came around. And while it wasn't a great game, especially offensively for either team back in that one in 2021, Georgia ended up winning 10-3, 0 offensive touchdowns in that game. The only touchdown scored was a defensive touchdown by Georgia on a pick six. So a defensive battle. But since that game has been played, these two teams, Georgia and Clemson, have gone in completely opposite directions. Clemson has gotten worse every single year since that loss in terms of number of losses. 2 losses, 3 losses, 3 losses again, 4 losses last year. Georgia, on the other hand, since that win over Clemson in week one of 2021, of course, has won 2 national championships and has not lost a regular season game in 3 straight seasons. In fact, the only team to beat Georgia at all in the last 3 seasons is Alabama in the postseason, twice in the SEC. Twice in the SEC championship, once in 2021, once last season in 2023. Clemson has struggled offensively over the last 3 or 4 years. There's a handful of reasons you might point to as to why that's the case. Obviously, they have not had the quarterback play that they had in the late 2010s when they went on really a remarkable run with, Deshaun Watson, and even Kelly Bryant had the one good year before then getting replaced by maybe the best of them all, Trevor Lawrence. And clearly they've not had a quarterback at that level since then. Now, that in and of itself shouldn't really be that surprising. Those were 2 all-time great quarterbacks. And, they had DJ Uiagalelei for a while. We all know that story. You see what happened this last weekend. Now they're on to Cade Klubnik. Now, these are 5-star quarterbacks. I mean, Clemson was getting their pick of the litter when it came to quarterbacks really over the last 10 years. And some of them have worked out, some of them have not. But to have 2 in a row now really that have not worked out, at least last season with Klubnik, we'll talk about maybe what that means for this year. But that's sort of an obvious thing when you look at Clemson. You can go, well, they don't have the quarterbacks. But it really goes beyond that. The wide receiver group as a whole is really down at Clemson compared to what it was in sort of those glory years, right? The T. Higgins, the Justin Ross, the Sammy Watkins, the DeAndre Hopkins. They haven't had anything really close to that in the last 3 or 4 years. Now, they have recruited really well at the wide receiver position. They seem to get a 5-star every cycle at the wide receiver position, but for whatever reason, they haven't really hit on one, at least not like they were in those late 2010 years. Last year, they had a lot of injuries at the wide receiver position, so they've got a lot of first, second, and third year players this year that have a ton of potential, a ton of talent, were highly recruited and rated coming out of high school, and have yet to really do anything on the college level. So the talent is there. We'll see if they can get the production to match the talent this year. A lot of that is going to depend on Cade Klubnik and how big of a leap or a jump he's able to take from last year, year one as a starter, to this year 2. He had several problems last year. Sacks were a big problem last year. Now, part of that goes to the offensive line, which is another area where if you look at Clemson over the last decade, the offensive line is just substandard. Now, to be fair to Clemson, even when they were sort of dominating and winning all those games in the late 2010s, I think even Clemson fans would agree, like, offensive line was never their strongest unit. Not that it was bad, but if you were looking at Clemson in the late 2010s, for example, and you looked at all the offensive position groups, wide receiver, running back, quarterback, offensive line, you tried to say, which of these is the least talented? It was offensive line even back then. But it seems to have gotten worse over the last couple of years. Now, defensively for Clemson, they've managed to continue to perform at a high level, even after losing a great defensive coordinator in Brent Venables, who, of course, now is the head coach out at Oklahoma. That defense has continued to roll on. They've had a top 10 defense almost every single year, really for a decade now, and it's not showing any signs of slowing down. Again, you can point to the defense maybe in a given year and say, well, the secondary wasn't as good this year as it was back in whatever year or whatever. But I don't think at any point over the last even 4 or 5 years where Clemson has been losing more games every single year than the year before, there's never really been a year where you could point to Clemson's defense at any of the 3 levels, defensive line, linebacker, or secondary, and really go, that's bad. Like, the secondary is bad, or the linebackers are bad, or whatever. Again, maybe a year or 2 where they weren't as good as a previous year or something, but Clemson's defense has been really good on all 3 levels, really for a long time. Maybe the secondary, again, if you want to do the, rate the position group things, is the secondary as good or as talented as their front 7? Probably not, but by no means would I consider Clemson to have a bad secondary. And then the other issue, of course, with Clemson, and everybody has beat this into the ground, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, is the decisions from a sort of philosophical standpoint that Dabo Swinney has made regarding his program and its use of NIL and the transfer portal. And when I talk about NIL, it's not that Clemson's not using it, but and I hear this from Clemson fans, so if I'm wrong, take it up with them, but they're using NIL more as a way to keep existing players from entering the portal, more so than maybe a recruiting tool out of high school. And, look, a lot of coaches are kind of struggling with how to balance that, right? You don't want to lose your good players to the portal, but you also have to continue to recruit at a high level. How do you balance that NIL deal? But the transfer portal in particular, I think, has really hurt Clemson over the last couple of years. Just their refusal to use it. And again, it's a philosophical, it's a principled stand that Dabo has taken. And I'm not here to say that he's making the right or wrong decision from a philosophical standpoint, or if that's his principles, he should just toss his principles aside. I mean, if this is the hill he wants to die on, I'm not saying that's wrong of him to do. But I do think that it is costing Clemson in terms of its ability to keep up with some of the top tier teams from a talent perspective. And obviously I'm not talking about somebody like Colorado or really even Florida State, who I think rely a little bit too heavily on the portal. Now, in Colorado's case, it's almost 100% portal, almost 0% high school recruiting. So that's an obvious outlier. But even in a place like Florida State, in my opinion, it's weighted a little bit too much towards the transfer portal. Now, when that hits, when you bring in 4 or 5 guys that you're hoping can be really good and immediate contributors, and all of them are, and all of them play at a high level, you can have a great pop year like Florida State did last year by bringing in players like Keon Coleman, like Jaheim Bell, players that were able to play well and contribute immediately at a very high level. The risk you run is that the players you bring in are not going to work out. They're not going to fit in. That it detracts from sort of the overall chemistry or teamwork that has gone into building that team over a number of years, and then you're sort of just inserting a handful of new players in there. So it's a risk either way. It worked for Florida State last year. It appears early in the season not to have worked for Florida State this year, with DJ Uiagalelei just not looking good at all. Some of the other pieces they brought in not showing up. Marvin Jones Jr., where was he Saturday? But if you look at Clemson, and even if you're a Clemson fan and you hate me or you hate Georgia or you think Dabo can do no wrong, it's hard to deny. Like, if you look at Clemson, even just last year as an example, and we'll go back to the Florida State thing, they bring in Keon Coleman. He ended up being one of the best wide receivers in the country. Do you think Clemson would have been better last year if they had Keon Coleman? Yeah. And you're going to say, well, there's no guarantee we would have got him. Maybe he wanted to go to Florida State. I agree, but that's not the point. The point is that there are players in the portal every single year, especially now, who could improve Clemson immediately. I don't think anybody is suggesting that Dabo should go out and get 15 or 20 players from the portal a year, But even the teams that recruit at a ridiculously high level year in and year out, of which Clemson is not one, by the way, they tend to recruit in the 10 to 15 range, which is really, really good. And we saw them win a couple of national titles while recruiting in the 10 to 15 range. The problem is the teams that are consistently out recruiting Clemson on a high school level, your Georgias, your Bamas, your Ohio States, your Michigans, your whoever, go on down the list, right? Not only are those teams now out recruiting Clemson at the high school level, they're also utilizing the portal to improve what is already a top 5, top 6 roster in all of college football. You look at Ohio State bringing in Caleb Downs through the transfer portal, an all-American safety, bringing in Quinshon Judkins at running back, a guy who broke 40-year-old records that were set by Herschel Walker, right? Bringing in quarterbacks, something like 4 of the last 5 Heisman winners have been transfer players. Do you think Clemson would have been better with some potential transfer quarterback in K. Clark? I mean, again, it's not about any one particular player that Clemson has that should be replaced through the portal, or any one particular player in the portal that Clemson should have brought in. It's the overall idea that could Clemson have been improved with maybe an offensive lineman or 2 out of the portal, maybe 1 wide receiver, and maybe 1 DB or so. You're talking 3-4 players maybe, right? To make a huge difference over the course of a season for a team like Clemson. So the combination of those things, right? Missing on some high-level quarterbacks, the wide receiver production just not being where Clemson is used to seeing it, and a flat-out refusal to use the portal. I think those things have combined to sort of lead Clemson one direction since Georgia and Clemson played opening week of 2021, and lead Georgia another direction. Of course, Georgia has won 2 national titles since they played Clemson week 1 of 2021. They have not lost a single regular season game since they played Clemson in 2021. They've just been on a remarkable run. It's pretty clear if you study Clemson and Georgia from 2021 till now, you see 2 teams headed in opposite directions. None of that in and of itself means Georgia is going to beat Clemson or isn't or anything. It's just something to consider when you're looking at this matchup. You can kind of draw a line from that sort of 2021 matchup with Clemson and Georgia, and those 2 lines will be going in opposite direction. I just think it's an interesting distinction to point out heading into this game. Now, Georgia and Clemson, while not considered a traditional rival in the true sense of the word, right? Clemson would consider somebody like South Carolina to be a rival, whereas Georgia, you would look at Georgia Tech or Florida or maybe Auburn. These are 2 teams that do have a long history of playing one another. They do not play each other as much in today's age of college football as maybe they did it back in the 80s, but they tend to play about twice every 10 years, right? They played twice in the 2000s. They played twice in the 2010s. This will be their second time now playing in the 2020s, and they've got several more games scheduled down the road, both neutral site and a home-and-home series. So it appears as though this Clemson-Georgia matchup is going to remain intact. Let's hope it does anyway, with sort of the never-ending conference expansions and teams changing conferences and expanding playoffs and all these different kind of things. Some of these future schedules are a little bit up in the air, but most Georgia and Clemson fans that I know enjoy seeing this game played. They like this series. They definitely wouldn't want to see it go away on any type of permanent basis. I think playing a couple of times every 10 years is sort of a good mix there for Georgia and Clemson in terms of scheduling. So let's talk about Georgia offensively, because there are some question marks about Georgia offensively heading into not only this season, but particularly this game. Let's start with the sort of overarching questions for the season. They lose 2 of their biggest playmakers off of last year's team, right? And wide receiver Ladd McConkey, and of course, everything tight end Brock Bowers. Now, Brock Bowers in particular cannot be replaced, period. Not only does Georgia not have a tight end that's ready to step in and can quote unquote just replace Brock Bowers, I don't think there's a tight end in the country that Georgia could bring in that could replace Brock Bowers. He was one of Georgia's all-time great players. I believe 20 years from now, people will look at Brock Bowers in a similar way to Herschel Walker. I don't think he'll ever be quite on that level, but in other words, he's just a generational talent at Georgia in terms of what he was able to do. Oscar Delp is next in line at tight end. Now, Georgia plays multiple tight ends at a time. A lot of times they run a lot of 2 tight end sets, and even when they're running 1 tight end sets, they rotated Brock Bowers in and out with some other guys, and Oscar Delp would have been Georgia's clear number 2 tight end each of the last 2 seasons. And he's really, really good. Had it not been for the fact that Brock Bowers was at Georgia for the last couple of years, I think Georgia fans and a lot of other people would be looking at Oscar Delp as one of the best tight ends maybe Georgia's had in a long time. Is he going to give you what Brock Bowers did? No. Again, Brock Bowers was a very special player that's likely never to be duplicated or replicated at UGA. But Oscar Delp is more than capable, as are the couple of guys behind him. Now, Ladd McConkey, that's a little bit of a more difficult question to answer for a variety of reasons. Ladd McConkey's not your prototypical wide receiver 1 or leading wide receiver really on most teams, right? He's an undersized, sort of quick, slot receiver, right? He's not 6'2", 6'3", 6'4". He's not an outside guy. He's not running into the end zone and catching jump balls and things like that. Now, Georgia's got a lot of wide receivers that fit the mold of a Ladd McConkey. In other words, sort of a little bit undersized, but really quick, really fast, really good hands, can run good routes, that kind of thing. So it's typical slot receivers, right? You think about like Dylan Bell, who had a really good year last year, or Dominic Lovett, who also had a really good year last year. Dominic Lovett, by the way, a transfer that Georgia picked up 2 cycles ago from Missouri. These are 2 guys with a ton of experience. They had a ton of catches last year. They had a ton of yards last year. Are either one of them individually as overall talented as Ladd McConkey ended up being? Probably not, but combined, I definitely think you're going to get more from those 2 combined from just a stats perspective than what you got from just a McConkey. The outside wide receiver positions is really where Georgia's going to have to answer some questions this year. They were going to, the plan was kind of rely on Ra Thomas, another transfer from a couple of years ago out of Mississippi State. Well, he's been kicked off the team 3 weeks ago, I guess now. So you're kind of going with plan B there. Maybe it's Jacoby Young, the kid they brought in from Miami out of the transfer portal. He's a big, tall, sort of prototypical outside wide receiver. We'll see how quickly he can kind of acclimate to the Georgia offense. I think the bottom line really for Georgia wide receivers, and most people know this because they remind me of it all the time, very rarely did Georgia have some type of dominant, prototypical wide receiver 1. Sort of famously or infamously, Georgia's only ever had 1 wide receiver go for 1,000 yards in a season, and that was over 20 years ago. Terrence Edwards in 2002. A.J. Green was really good in the late 2000s, but he never had 1,000 yards. George Pickens was really, really good. He never had anywhere close to 1,000 yards. So for a long time, Georgia has sort of looked at their wide receivers as a group. What sort of production can Georgia get from this group of wide receivers, as opposed to, okay, we've got this star X receiver. How do we get him the ball? That's never really been Georgia's philosophy at wide receiver, even predating Kirby Smart. It's always been more of a, you hear the term running back by committee like all the time. You rarely hear the term wide receiver by committee, but that's really what Georgia has been for the majority of my lifetime, really. Even the last couple of years where Ladd McConkey, maybe you would have considered Georgia's best wide receiver, he never got anywhere close to 1,000 yards. Georgia has always done a really good job, for better or worse, of spreading the ball around. Georgia's going to have, probably 6 or 7 different wide receivers this year with between 300 and 600 or 700 yards receiving. Are they going to have a first-round draft pick on the outside that goes for 1,000 yards? No, they never do. But I do think Georgia's wide receivers are capable of getting the job done. They do need to answer the question of sort of, who's your kind of outside, sort of over-the-top jump ball in the end zone type of guy. We'll see who that ends up being. The offensive line is going to be one of the best in the country. They get a ton back from last year. This is going to be probably the best matchup of the game between Georgia and Clemson, is going to be this offensive line of Georgia against the defensive front of Clemson, which is clearly one of the best in America. It was a great matchup last go-around. A couple of years ago when we played, and I expect it to be another great matchup again this season. Georgia's running back situation, another area where you're looking at some question marks here. I'll get to the Travis Etienne thing in a second, but let's start with the other guy, Roderick Robinson. Heading into the season a couple of weeks ago, it looked like ETN was going to be RB1 and Roderick Robinson was going to be RB2. And then after that, you had Branson Robinson, a true freshman, Nate Frazier. You've got a kid, Cash Jones, who played a lot last year when people were injured. Maybe he ends up in the mix somewhere. Dwight Phillips, another true freshman that's more of a straight line speed guy. That was sort of looking like how the running back rotation was going to go. Well, Roderick Robinson ended up having to have toe surgery. He's out for a number of weeks. We'll see. It could be months. And the ETN situation is up in the air. So that's technically Georgia's RB1 and RB2. Now, Georgia plays 4 or 5 running backs a game, and they've done this for as long as I can remember, really, at least the last decade, right? You go back to 2017 when Georgia had both Sony Michel and Nick Chubb on the same team, two just all-time great college running backs. Chubb, I think, averaged 11 carries a game that year. Michel averaged 8. Georgia just rotates running backs in and out. It's still going to hurt missing those two, though. Branson Robinson, who... Let's assume for a second ETN doesn't play. If you don't know, ETN was arrested and charged with a DUI and a couple of other driving offenses earlier in the offseason. The DUI has been dropped. And this is something, I don't know. I don't know if it turns out he wasn't DUI or if it was part of a plea negotiation. That's probably what it was, a plea negotiation. So anyway, the DUI was dropped. He pled guilty to, I think, reckless driving, minor in possession of alcohol, I believe, might have been one of the other charges. And he got basically, community service, pay a fine, that kind of thing. And Kirby Smart has not answered one way or another. Yes, he's going to be suspended. No, he's not going to be suspended. If he is suspended, will it be for the Clemson game or will it be for another game? He just doesn't answer any of those questions. And it's got nothing to do with this specific case in particular. He's always been this way. I remember a game last year. I believe it was Ra Thomas now that I think about it. But anyway, a game started last year and everybody's like, where's Ra Thomas? I think it was him. And then he just never played. And then at the end of the game, when Kirby was asked about it and he was like, yeah, he had to sit out this game, the whole whatever team rules deal. In other words, Kirby doesn't ever announce these things ahead of time. Like if a player is suspended, no one knows it really until the game starts. And you're just like, well, I guess that guy's not playing. I think he probably should be suspended. Nothing against him personally. Everybody's entitled to make a mistake and get a second chance and move on and all those kinds of things. But it's the overarching issue at Georgia involving all of these driving related charges over the last year and a half. I feel like because there's just been so many of them now at this point that Kirby probably needs to take a more aggressive and proactive approach in terms of punishment. And I actually think it would do Kirby and the university a lot of good to just announce, especially if he is suspended, to just say, yeah, look, we're suspending him. We're not playing games anymore with all these driving things. If you can't do what you're supposed to do off the football field, then you're not going to get an opportunity to do what you want to do on the football. Like, I think that would go a long way from a PR perspective if they would just come out and say it. But Kirby thinks everything's a nuclear secret when it comes to the world of college football. No media is allowed at the practices. He doesn't give injury reports. He won't tell you what is wrong with a player or how long they're out if they're injured or when they're coming back. He won't tell you if anybody's suspended. He won't tell you who's starting. He doesn't release depth charts the week before a game like most teams do. He just thinks everything's a top secret, nuclear government secret. And so we won't know about ETN, but let's assume ETN doesn't play. Okay. Well, that Georgia's down their RB1 in theory in ETN, their RB2 in Roderick Robinson, who's out with the surgery, and Branson Robinson would probably be the running back that gets the start. Now, a really good running back, very highly talented, highly rated and recruited out of high school, but he's coming off of an injury too. He hasn't played in almost 2 years. So you don't, physically he's rehabbed and back to 100%, but how is he going to handle that mentally coming back from an injury, psychologically? Who knows? I don't know. Behind him is a true freshman who was playing high school at this time last year. Not only that, it was a true freshman who did not early enroll. Nate Frazier is who I'm talking about, and he didn't early enroll. So it's not like he's been at UJ since January, and now so you're going, okay, well, he's been there 8 months now. No, he's been there basically 3 months. And it's looking like, especially if ETN can't play, that he will be RB2. Could this have any type of effect or impact on the game? Well, it could. It's hard to forecast that and know for sure, right? Vegas doesn't think it's going to have an impact or an effect on the game one way or the other because the line is not moved one way or the other. It's been at 13.5 for a couple of weeks now and hasn't moved. I think potentially the biggest problem for Georgia when it comes to the running back situation in this game and whether or not ETN plays or not may not have anything to do with Georgia's ability to run the ball, but it could have a lot to do with passing downs, passing plays, and things like that. In other words, do you want a true freshman, in this case, Nate Frazier, who's been on the campus for 3 months, standing next to Carson Beck in a shotgun on 3rd and 9, having to pick up a blitzing All-American Clemson linebacker? I don't think you do. So what's going to end up happening is he's probably not going to be in the game in that spot. You know who would? ETN. ETN would normally be that guy because ETN can both catch, run routes out of the backfield, that kind of thing, and is also experienced enough and played enough major Power 5 football. You got to remember, he came from Florida. He's experienced enough to know, okay, this guy's coming on a blitz. I got to stay in and pick him up, and he's talented and good enough to be able to do that. Don't know about that with a true freshman like Nate Frazier. Branson Robinson, on the other hand, is a big body. He's the one you would want back there out of him and Frazier in terms of body size to stand in there and take on a blitzing linebacker or whatever the case. But he's not going to be doing much catching and running out of the backfield. So if you have him in there on a 3rd and 8, chances are you're not throwing him the ball. You know he's staying. So anyway, it may become somewhat of a disadvantage in that regard. But I still trust Georgia's offensive line, even against Clemson's defensive front, to be able to open up some holes for talented running backs like Branson Robinson and Nate Frazier to be able to run the ball. Clemson, on the other hand, offensively, when they have the ball, I don't trust Cade Klubnik at all, period. Is it possible he has flipped a switch from year 1 to year 2? Yeah, of course it is. We've seen it happen before, right? But I got to see it. I can't have blind faith in a guy like Klubnik, who I saw play terribly for the majority of last year. An absolute turnover machine. Clemson turned the ball over in every single game last year. I've heard a lot of people talk about him sort of turning the corner midway through last season because Clemson won, I think, 5 of their last 6 games or something like that. That's true, but Klubnik threw an interception in every one of those games. He holds on to the ball too long, even going back to the bowl game. And you can say what you want about bowl games and how much they matter or don't matter. Nobody sat out. Nobody sat out. He was sacked 8 times. 8. Now, I don't care how good the defense is that you're playing. If you get sacked 8 times, you're holding on to the ball too long, period. What defense were they playing? Kentucky. So you make up your own mind about how elite you think that Kentucky defense is, particularly the front 7 in terms of rushing the quarterback versus what Cade Klubnik might see this Saturday against Georgia. You can make your own determination on that. Clemson won that game 38-35, but 8 sacks. They turned the ball over. Georgia, on the other hand, beat that same Kentucky team by 40 points, 50-something to 17 or whatever it was. So I don't blindly trust Cade Klubnik's ability to sort of put Clemson on his shoulders and carry Clemson to a victory over a top 5 ranked Georgia team. Number 1 in most polls. I have them at number 2 in mine. They're in everyone's top 3. I don't trust Cade Klubnik's ability to do that. Again, could he? Could some miraculous change have occurred in the offseason with Klubnik? Yes, I've seen it happen before from year 1 to year 2. But I've got to see that before I can blindly believe it. Now, you look at the wide receivers, a lot of talent out there, a lot of young, inexperienced talent that has never done anything at the college level. So again, you're asking yourself the question, is it possible that 1 or 2 of those highly rated wide receivers that haven't played either because of injury or depth chart or whatever, and now are playing, is it possible that 1 or 2 of those guys ends up being sort of superstar playmaking type wide receivers? Yeah, it's always possible. Is it likely? Is it likely that even if they are, that Cade Klubnik's going to be able to get him the ball? No, I don't think so. Not in this game. It seems like it's asking a lot of Cade Klubnik to sort of drastic improvement, 180 degrees type of turnaround from what he was doing last year immediately this season in game one against this particular defense. That seems like a lot to ask. It seems like a lot to ask these wide receivers who are either coming back from injury or who have never played before, even though they're talented, highly rated and recruited on. It seems a lot to ask of them to go out there and show that, improve that. Game one against this Georgia defense. And then you move to the offensive line. It's gotten worse the last 3 or 4 years at Clemson. Now, I love Matt Luke. They brought Matt Luke in as an offensive line coach, and I love Matt Luke. He was at Georgia for a couple of years, and then he retired. I don't think we'll ever know the real story about that, but he, quote-unquote, retired at a very young age from Georgia, took a year or two off. Now he's back, offensive line coach at Clemson. Massive upgrade in coaching there for Clemson with Matt Luke. Is he a miracle worker? Is he going to turn water into wine? No. He's a great recruiter. And, Georgia had an amazing offensive line, and Matt Luke made it better. We had Sam Pittman prior to Matt Luke. Sam Pittman's probably the best offensive line coach in the country. Matt Luke was one of the best, right? So we lose Pittman, the best offensive line coach in the country, and who do we get? Luke right behind him. So Luke was working with what Sam Pittman had left. Matt Luke at Clemson is working with what was there before, which wasn't very good. So do I think it's a great hire? Yes. Do I think it will we'll see improvements? Yes. I don't know if you're going to see enough again in week one. That's the thing. Clemson is going to be a better team, I think, in week 5, 6, 7, and 8 than they are in week one. Too much is new. Now we move to the running back position for Clemson. Will Shipley's gone, right? Now, all of a sudden, every Clemson fan you find says, well, Maffa's better. Now, I heard a few Clemson fans saying that last year that preferred Maffa over Shipley or thought Maffa was a better runner than Shipley. I don't necessarily agree with that, but to be fair, there were some Clemson fans that were saying that even last year when Shipley was there. But the majority, look, Will Shipley was great. And the thing about Will Shipley, they're focusing on the yards per carry, all right? And I get it. Yards per carry is an important stat when it comes to looking at a running back. But just think about how college football has evolved at the running back position over the last few years, right? Very rarely do you have a running back that's getting 25, 30 carries a game, okay? You rarely have that. You have what you had at Clemson last year, which is Will Shipley generally getting 15 carries a game and Maffa getting 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 and maybe a little more one week and a little less next week, but you get the idea. It's a tandem, right? It's a 1-2 punch. Every team wants it. A lot of teams have it. And Clemson had it with Shipley and Maffa. And the thing about that is they're two completely different styles, right? Will Shipley could return punts. He could return kicks. He could line up in the slot. He could catch screen passes, swing routes. He could run out and go, or wheel routes up the side. He was kind of a do-it-all type of player. And on top of being a really good runner with the ball, right? Maffa doesn't bring all of that. He's a great between the tackle kind of bowling ball type runner. He's a really good running back. I'm not talking shit about Maffa. I love Maffa. All right. I just question specifically with the yards per carry thing. Do you think he's going to maintain that yards per carry average now that he's the primary running back and someone else is coming in as the change of pace? That's the only question I have. I've been making this same point about Ole Miss this year. Ole Miss had Quinshawn Judkins, and I forget the guy behind him's name now. And Quinshawn Judkins was the better running back. That's just a fact, okay? The other guy had more yards per carry. So now Quinshawn Judkins leaves Ole Miss and goes to Ohio State, and the Ole Miss fans are like, well, the other guy is better anyway, had more yards per carry. It's not all about yards per carry. Maffa's a really good running back. Can he be as good this year as he was last year now that he's the primary guy and not the change of pace guy that you kind of come in to pound a worn out team between the tackles, which is kind of how they used Maffa last year. So we'll see. So the problem with Clemson offensively is I think there's too many, well, if this and if that and if that against a Georgia defense that has very little, if any, questions at all, at all. There's one corner position at Georgia that's kind of up in the air. But is Clemson a team that can take advantage of that in week one? I don't think so. Georgia lost the line of scrimmage battle last year in the SEC championship game against Alabama. Again, Alabama's the only team to beat Georgia since COVID. That's not a single other team has beat Georgia. And don't even type anything about the schedule. In the last 3 years, Georgia has beat Clemson, Oregon, Ohio State, Michigan, Alabama, TCU, Florida State, LSU. I mean, just name a top 10 team in the last 3 years. Georgia has beat them. They haven't lost to anybody besides Clemson, besides Bama. Bama did dominate Georgia in the trenches in that game. Defensively, could be a problem. If Georgia's offensive line is not ready to go, Clemson's defensive line versus Georgia's offensive line, to me, is the only possible mismatch in Clemson's favor in this game, I think. I like Georgia's wide receivers against their secondary. I like Georgia's defensive line against Clemson's offensive line. I love Georgia's linebackers. If there's going to be an issue for Georgia in this game, it could potentially be that if Georgia's offensive line, for whatever reason, underperforms, combined with the fact that you're going to be playing a couple of inexperienced running backs. Even Branson Robinson, who's been at Georgia for a few years, like I said, hasn't played in almost 2 years, coming off a really bad injury a couple of years ago. So, and then if ETN can't play, the number 2 is going to be a true freshman, Nate Frazier. So that is a possibility where Clemson could take control of that game, defensively shutting down Georgia's running game. I don't think they're shutting down Georgia's passing game. Carson Beck is the best returning quarterback in college football, according to most people's lists. Not according to me. Forget what I think or what I say. Just look up lists, best returning college quarterback. You're going to see Carson Beck at him near the top of every list. He's the favorite to win the Heisman. He had arguably the second best season of any Georgia quarterback in history last year, and that was his first year starting. He threw for over 4,000 yards, a ton of touchdowns, very few interceptions. Now, he's not very mobile. If you're looking for a knock on Carson Beck, and maybe you don't, if you're a Clemson fan especially, and maybe you didn't watch, as much Georgia last year as some other people did, there's a couple of areas where you look at Carson Beck and you go, I wish he was a little bit better there. The first one would be the deep ball. He struggled to hit the deep ball last year. Georgia had very few explosive plays last year, deep ball wise. Now, you throw the ball to Ladd McConkey behind the line of scrimmage and he runs for 40 yards, making people miss. Yes, I'm talking about balls thrown in the air. He did struggle with the deep ball. And it's not a situation where he overthrew him every time or underthrew him every time or threw it out of bounds every time. It was all over the place. I don't know if that was a timing issue, maybe something they weren't working on enough in practice. Georgia rotates wide receivers in and out on every single play. It's something that has drove me up the wall for years as a Georgia fan. You'll see this weekend, they'll play 8 different receivers. In a lot of cases, in one drive, they'll play 5, 6, 7 different wide receivers. And, I've questioned out loud a bunch of times, how do you develop chemistry with any one wide receiver when you're trying to develop chemistry with 10 wide receivers? So I don't know if that's what it was, or if, for whatever reason, it's just a throw he can't make. So you look for him to get better there with the deep ball. And the other thing is, he's not going to be running for 100 yards or anything like that in this game. If you've watched Carson Beck play at all, he's much more of a traditional pocket passer than sort of a scrambler or a dual threat. Like you think of like Jaden Daniels or even Caleb Williams or Shedeur Sanders can run better than Carson Beck. Now, he's not a statue. He can move around. He's not like y'all. Clemson fans know DJ Uiagalelei, right? He's not that. DJ moves. It looks like he's moving in slow motion. It's like it almost looks like his feet are velcroed to the grass when it's weird. Cinder block feet. He's not like that. If it's 3rd and 4, 3rd and 5, 3rd and 6, and maybe the protection breaks down, he's dodged a sack here and there and picked up 5 or 6 yards to get a first down when Georgia needed it. He can do that when you need him to. But, there's not going to be any quarterback draws. There's not going to be any naked bootlegs where he takes off running. He's not Stetson Bennett in that way, okay? If he takes off running, it's because no one was open or the protection broke down and it's 3rd and 4 and he thinks he can pick up 5 yards. That's it. There will be no 60, 70, 80-yard touchdown runs from Carson Beck. So in today's age of football, maybe you wish he was a little bit more mobile. So that would be the 2 areas you look for him to improve. The bottom line for me when I look at this game, Georgia has really dominated Clemson throughout history. These two teams have played a ton. Georgia's 43-18 against Clemson all time. So just a completely one-sided series in Georgia's favor. These two teams have gone in opposite directions since they played at the beginning of the season in 2021. Georgia hasn't lost a single regular season game. Clemson has lost more regular season games every single year than the year before since that game in 2021, culminating with a 4-loss season last year. You look at opening week games. Georgia hasn't lost an opening week game since 2013. Trivia. Who beat Georgia in the opening week in 2013? I bet the Clemson fans remember. Clemson, on the other hand, has lost 2 of their last 3 season openers. They lost to Georgia in 2021. They won their season opener in 2022, I think, against Georgia Tech. And then they lost their season opener last year against Duke. If you're a betting degenerate like I am, Georgia's a 13.5-point favorite. Clemson is 1-3 against the spread in their last 4 season opening games. And in 2 of those games, they lost as a favorite. Hard to believe this now, but Clemson was favored to beat Georgia in that game in 2021, and Georgia beat them. Clemson, of course, was favored to beat Duke last year in a season opener, and they lost. So Clemson has not performed well in opening week games. Georgia, on the other hand, has. The last time Georgia had a big opening week game was not last season, but the season before against Oregon, and they beat them by almost 50 points. The year before that was the Clemson game. They beat Clemson. Last year, they played a nobody in week 1 and didn't even cover the spread. Georgia tends to play better in these opening week games when they have a big opponent to prepare for. I really don't see a way Clemson wins this game. Could they keep it close? Could they keep it within the 13.5 or 14 points? They could, especially if Georgia's not able to run the ball for one of the reasons that we already discussed. Maybe the offensive line gets dominated by Clemson's front. Maybe the 2 running backs, maybe Etienne can't play and you're relying on Branson Robinson, who's coming back from an injury, and a Nate Frazier, who's a true freshman. And, maybe Nate Frazier puts the ball on the ground a time or 2, or makes some freshman mistakes, or fails to pick up a blitz when he needs to on 3rd down, and Georgia ends up getting sacked and have to punt instead of keeping the drive alive, whatever. And Clemson finds a way to keep this thing closer. I think what's more likely to happen is that Georgia just wears Clemson down over the course of this game and sort of pulls away a little bit in the second half. I'm going to take Georgia minus 13.5 here. I think Georgia wins by 3 scores, 17 to 20 points, something like that. I've seen a lot of score predictions in like the 38 to 17 range. I think that's probably pretty accurate. Maybe that might be a little bit too high, maybe more around the 30 to 13. 35 to 21, 33 to 17, somewhere in there. I like Georgia to win the game, and I like Georgia to cover the 13.5. Appreciate you watching. Have a good morning.